The lime was still fresh on the graves when they opened. Every spring, the tombs outside Jerusalem were painted white before Passover, a warning line, so that pilgrims coming up the road would know where the dead were and step around them. Which means that on the afternoon we are about to enter, the burial grounds ringing that city were the most visible thing on the landscape. Bright chalk white against gray limestone and spring grass, running down the slopes of the Kidron Valley, scattered across the flank of the Mount of Olives, crowded into the Hinnom to the south. A city of the living, inside a ring of marked doors. At around 3 o'clock, on the day before the Sabbath of Passover week, the ground under those doors moved. And according to one man, one and no other in the entire ancient world, some of those doors did not stay shut, and the people behind them walked into the city. The Gospel of Matthew records what happened next in 4 short clauses, and then never returns to the subject. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of holy ones who had died were raised and came out and went into the city and were seen by many people. That is the whole account. Matthew 27, verses 51 to 53. Fewer than 60 words in the original Greek. No names, no number, no description of what they looked like or what they said. No account of who saw them or what those witnesses did afterward or where any of it ended. Mark does not mention it. Luke does not mention it. John does not mention it. Paul, who spent an entire chapter of 1 Corinthians assembling a list of everyone who saw a resurrected person, does not mention it. Josephus, who catalogued portents over Jerusalem in detail, does not mention it. No Roman record mentions it. One writer, one paragraph. Then silence for 2,000 years. So this is the question we will hold for the next half hour. And I want to be honest at the start. We are not going to solve it. We are going to do something better. We will walk into that afternoon with everything history and archaeology can actually tell us. How those tombs were built, how they were closed, what force it takes to open one, and find out exactly where the evidence stops and the argument begins. Because that argument is 2,000 years old, it has never been settled, and it is far stranger than most people have been told. To understand what force could do that, you first have to know what those doors were, and almost everything you have been told about them is wrong. But start with when. The traditional date is the year 33, and it is the anchor this account uses. It is not settled. The defensible range runs from 30 to 33, because the evidence constrains without deciding. The crucifixion fell on the day of preparation, which requires the 14th of Nisan to land on a Friday, and both years satisfy that test. Serious historians hold both. Anyone who tells you the question is closed is selling you certainty the sources do not supply. What is not in doubt is the political architecture of that afternoon. Tiberius was emperor and had spent 7 years on the island of Capri, governing through intermediaries and rarely seen. Judea was a second-tier province, run by a prefect from the equestrian order, and that prefect was Pontius Pilate, a man we can put our hands on. In 1961, at Caesarea on the coast, archaeologists turned over a block of limestone reused as building material and found a dedication cut into its face naming Pilate, prefect of Judea, not procurator, the title later writers assumed. Prefect, exactly as the earliest sources have it. In Jerusalem, the high priest was Joseph Caiaphas, son-in-law of Annas, from a family that held the office across a generation by cultivating precisely the right relationship with Rome. And a bone box carrying that name came out of a burial cave in North Talpiot in 1990. These are not decorations. They are the point. The men in this account are in the ground, under their own names, and so were the people we are about to go looking for. And the city itself was full. Jerusalem's resident population is estimated somewhere between 20 and 80,000, depending on how you reconstruct the built area inside the walls. At Passover, it multiplied. By how much is genuinely unknown, since Josephus gives festival figures that are universally treated as inflated beyond possibility. What is certain is that the city could not hold everyone who came. Pilgrims camped on the surrounding hillsides and in the valleys, on every slope with room, which means they camped among the tombs. That spring, the whitewashed burial grounds outside Jerusalem had people sleeping between them. Now let me show you what those tombs actually were, because almost everything popular imagination supplies about them is wrong, and the truth is more useful. Jerusalem is built out of the stone it is buried in. The local rock is a soft, pale limestone that masons call meleke, literally, royal stone. It cuts almost like hard cheese when freshly quarried and hardens on exposure to air, which is why the city could carve monumental architecture and elaborate tombs out of the same hillsides it stood on. It is also a heavily bedded stone, laid down in layers, which means it fractures along the planes it was formed in. Remember that. It will matter shortly. A family tomb was not a hole in the ground. It was a room. You entered through a doorway often cut deliberately low, so that a person had to stoop into a chamber with a rectangular pit sunk into the floor so mourners could stand upright while working. Around that pit ran benches of rock, and driven back into the walls were narrow shafts, each wide enough for one body. The body was wrapped in linen with spices, laid on a shelf, and left. And then, this is the part most people do not know, the family came back. After about a year, when the flesh had gone, they gathered the bones and placed them in a limestone box roughly the length of a thigh bone. Thousands have been recovered, many with the name scratched into the side by an unskilled hand, sometimes misspelled. A father's name, a daughter's name. These were not sealed monuments. They were rooms families opened and re-entered as a matter of ordinary duty. And how were they closed? Here is where the popular picture fails. Ask most people to imagine a first-century tomb, and they will describe a great circular stone rolling in a channel. Those existed. They are also extraordinarily rare. Of the many hundreds of tombs from this period surveyed around Jerusalem, only a small handful, you can count them on one hand, used a rolling disc, and every one of them belonged to a family with serious wealth. The ordinary closure, the one used across the whole burial landscape we have been describing, was a squared block of stone shoved into the doorway and left there. Not mortared, not hinged, not locked, held in place by its own weight and by how well it fitted the opening. Hold that image, because it answers the mechanical half of our question. What does it take to open a tomb like that? Not much. A blocking stone resists force pushing straight in against it. What it cannot resist is the ground moving sideways underneath it, because that stone does not need to be lifted, only shifted out of its seat. And Meliki limestone under seismic stress does not crumble. It splits cleanly along the bedding planes it was laid down in, which is precisely what Matthew describes, in that order. The earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs were opened. He is not describing a miracle of doors. He is describing an earthquake doing what an earthquake does to unmortared stone in bedded rock on unstable valley slopes. And because those slopes held a whole district of such doorways at once, a single shock does not open one tomb. It opens a field of them. Is there physical evidence for that earthquake?
Right there at 42 centimeters.
There is something, and I want to give it to you carefully, because this is exactly the detail that gets overstated everywhere else. Along the western shore of the Dead Sea, the lakebed sediment has built up in annual layers, thin bands, one per year, like tree rings laid flat. Earthquakes disturb those layers visibly, and researchers coring that sediment have identified a major event around the year 31 before Christ, which Josephus independently describes, and a second, weaker disturbance in the early 1st century, dated loosely somewhere between the years 26 and 36. That is a real finding, and it is not a confirmation. The resolution cannot name a year, let alone a Friday afternoon. What it gives us is narrower and still worth having. That ground was moving in exactly that generation, and Matthew is describing something it was capable of doing. So we can account for the doors. We cannot account for what came out of them, and that is where every honest treatment of this passage arrives. Before we go further into it, I want to ask you something, and I am asking it because of where we are about to stand for the rest of this account. There is a stretch of this story, we will get to it shortly, where something has already happened and nothing can be seen yet. The stones are moved, the doors are open, and for a day and a half, nothing comes out. I suspect some of you know that stretch better than you would like to. A prayer that was answered somewhere you cannot see it. A change you were told had already been made in a situation that looks exactly the way it looked before. Have you lived in that interval? Not the crisis, the waiting after the crisis, when you were supposed to have hope and have no evidence. Tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and this particular passage is written for the people standing in exactly that gap. Now, who were they? Matthew calls them holy ones. In Greek, hagioi, the word usually rendered saints. In Jewish usage of the period, that term points most naturally to the righteous dead of Israel, not to recently deceased followers of Jesus. Beyond that, Matthew gives us nothing, not one name, in a gospel that names people constantly. But the text does narrow the field in two ways, and both are worth having. First, they were buried in or near Jerusalem because they walk into the city. That excludes the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried at Hebron, 20 miles to the south. Moses was buried in Moab, in a grave the book of Deuteronomy explicitly says no one could find. Second, and this one is decisive, there is David. He is the single most attractive candidate anyone could propose. Jerusalem's king, buried in Jerusalem, the figure whose resurrection would carry the most weight. And roughly 7 weeks after that Friday, Peter stood up in that same city, in front of a Passover crowd that had not gone home, and said plainly that David died and was buried, and that his tomb was still there among them. Acts chapter 2, verse 29. He said it in the one place on earth where anyone in the audience could have walked out and checked. Whoever came out of those tombs, David did not. And how many is many? Matthew's word is polloi. It carries an indefinite plural with no upper limit stated, and it will not do what people want it to do in either direction. It cannot mean 2 or 3. It also cannot bear the crowd that most retellings quietly import, because Matthew did not write a crowd. He wrote many and left it there. The honest range is something like dozens. Any specific number you have ever heard attached to this passage was supplied by someone other than Matthew. Which brings us to the sentence itself, and to the problem that has occupied interpreters for 16 centuries. Read Matthew's order carefully. The tombs were opened, and many bodies were raised. That is verse 52, and it sits at the moment of death on Friday afternoon. Then verse 53 says they came out of the tombs after his resurrection, went into the holy city, and appeared to many. After his resurrection. that is Sunday. So what happened in between? The Greek allows two readings and forces neither. On one reading, the phrase attaches to the coming out. The tombs opened on Friday. The bodies were raised on Friday, and then they remained where they were until Sunday, and only then walked out. An event in two stages, with roughly 36 hours of nothing in the middle. On the other reading, Matthew has compressed the whole thing into a single unit and narrated it out of sequence, mentioning the opening of the tombs alongside the other signs at the moment of death, because that is where it belongs thematically, while the entire event actually occurred on the third day. Grammar will not decide between them, but theology pushes hard in one direction, and you should see why. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 that Christ has been raised as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. First fruits is not a poetic flourish. It is a harvest term, and it was a live festival in that very week. The first sheaf of the barley harvest was brought to the temple and lifted before God as a claim on everything still standing in the field. To call Christ the first fruits is to say he is first. Not among the first, first. And if a group of holy ones walked out of their tombs on Friday afternoon, alive, in front of witnesses, while Jesus was still in his, then he was not first, and Paul's central image collapses. That pressure is why most interpreters, ancient and modern, read verse 53 as holding the emergence back until Sunday. It is a theologically motivated reading. That does not make it wrong. It does mean you should know it is doing work. So stand in it, because if the two-stage reading is right, what follows is the strangest 36 hours in the New Testament, and almost nobody has ever walked you through it. Friday, mid-afternoon, the ground moves. Across the valleys east and south of the city, stones that have sat in their doorways for years, some for generations, shift an inch, then another, and go over. Not one, a district of them. The sound would have carried, rock on rock, then dust, then nothing. And the doors that had been whitewashed 3 weeks earlier so that no one would come too close are standing open on the hillsides above a city that is preparing for a festival. Down in the valley, two men are working against the sunset. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus have a body to bury, and less than 3 hours of legal daylight to do it in. They are, as far as we can reconstruct, the only people the Gospels place inside that burial district in those particular hours. They finish. They set a stone in a doorway. They go home, then Sabbath. And on Sabbath, nothing happens. This is the part I want you to sit with, because it is the part every retelling skips. The city keeps the feast. Lamb is eaten in rooms behind closed shutters. The disciples are scattered and silent. Guards are posted at one particular tomb because the authorities are worried about a stolen body, and on the slopes all around them, in the Kidron and on the flank of the Mount of Olives and down into the Hinnom, an entire field of doorways is standing open in the dark, and no one comes out of a single one. A full day, then a night, then the gray hours before dawn. The decisive thing had already happened. There was nothing to see. And then, at first light, on the first day of the week, the ground moves again. Matthew chapter 28, verse 2, a second earthquake, and a second stone rolled away from a second doorway. Matthew has bracketed the entire weekend between two shocks and two opened tombs. The second one is the only one anybody remembers. But if he means what the two-stage reading says he means, then the second shock is not only the moment a tomb in a garden came open, it is the moment the field came out. Now the hardest question, because avoiding it would be dishonest and you would be right to notice, why does no one else mention this? we have a control case, and it is exceptionally good. In Bethany, less than 2 miles away, one man came out of one rock-cut tomb. His name was Lazarus, and we know what happened next in detail. A large crowd traveled out from the city specifically to see him, not to see Jesus, to see the man who had been dead. And John records that the chief priests then made plans to kill Lazarus as well, because his continued existence was drawing people away. One man, one tomb. Result: crowds, documented testimony, and a murder plot. Now scale that up. Many people, many tombs. Walking into a city packed with pilgrims from across the empire, appearing to many. Matthew's own word. And the result is nothing. No crowd, no named witness, no countermeasure from the authorities. Not a line in Mark, Luke, or John. Not a line in Acts. A book specifically about what the Jerusalem church proclaimed in Jerusalem. Not a line in Paul, at the exact point in 1 Corinthians 15, where it would have been his most powerful available evidence, in a chapter written to prove that resurrection happens. Not a line in Josephus, born in that city within a decade, who collected precisely this kind of report. That contrast is the strongest argument against reading the passage as straightforward reportage, and I am not going to soften it for you. It cuts. But it cuts both ways. And here is the other edge. Matthew gained nothing by including this. It corroborates nothing because he supplies no corroboration. It converts no skeptic because he names no witness. It was attacked immediately. Within 100 years, the philosopher Celsus was using it as proof that the Christian story refuted itself. A claim of public wonders that no public record confirmed. And when Origen answered him, he could not produce the confirmation, because there was none to produce. A writer, inventing an apologetic detail, invents one that helps. Matthew kept a sentence that has embarrassed his own side for 2,000 years, and he kept it in a gospel he was otherwise writing with enormous care. That is a fact about the text, and it belongs on the table next to the silence. So what is it? 3 readings hold the field today, and I am going to give you all 3 without telling you which one wins, because I do not know which one wins, and neither does anyone else. It is history, briefly told. Matthew reports what happened in the same flat register he uses for the torn curtain, without elaboration, because elaboration was not his purpose. The commentator R.T. France notes that Matthew alone records it, and does so inside plain historical narration, with no signal that he means anything else. Or it is apocalyptic imagery, and this is not a modern attempt to explain the passage away. Darkness, earthquake, opened graves. These are the standard furniture of the day of the Lord in the prophets, and ancient writers attached cosmic portents to world-changing deaths as a recognized convention. On this reading, Matthew is doing what his tradition trained him to do. When the scholar Michael Licona argued along these lines in 2010, the professional consequences for him were severe and public, which tells you this is not a quiet academic disagreement. Or it is both. A real event, told deliberately out of order, placed at the moment of death because that is where its meaning belongs, a preview of a resurrection still to come. And now watch what happens when you set Matthew's 4 clauses against the prophets, because whichever reading you take, this part is not in dispute. Ezekiel chapter 37, in the Valley of Dry Bones, records a promise from God to his people in 2 verbs. I will open your graves, and I will raise you from your graves. Open and raise. Matthew writes, the tombs were opened, and bodies were raised. The vocabulary is not general resurrection language. It is Ezekiel's specific pair, in Ezekiel's order. Now, Ezekiel's own vision is about the restoration of a nation, not about individual bodies leaving individual tombs, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But Matthew appears to be saying that the promise attached to that vision has stopped being a vision. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Matthew's two most conspicuous word choices in this passage are many and fallen asleep. Both of them are sitting in that verse in Daniel, and Daniel places that awakening at the end of all things, which means Matthew is describing an end-of-the-world event breaking out early, incompletely, and in one small district of one occupied province. And then Zechariah 14, which is the one that should stop you. Split ground on the Mount of Olives, a population fleeing an earthquake, and the Lord arriving with all his holy ones, the Kedoshim, the same word standing behind Matthew's saints. First-century Jews read that chapter as a description of the last days. Matthew put 3 of its 4 elements into a single Friday afternoon on that exact hillside and did not comment. Whatever else that Friday was, Matthew is telling his readers that the ground under Israel's oldest promises had moved. There is one witness Matthew does give us, and he is the reason the whole passage is there. Standing at the execution site was a Roman centurion, with soldiers under him, doing the ordinary work of the empire. Matthew places him at verse 54, immediately after the tombs, and connects him directly to what he had just experienced, the earthquake and the things that took place. And this professional executioner, this man who had presumably done this job many times, said out loud that the man they had just killed was the Son of God. That is Matthew's payoff, not a proof, a recognition, and it arrives from the outside, from the occupier, from a Gentile with no stake in Israel's promises. Matthew has been building toward that moment for 27 chapters. And then there is the other reaction, and it is uglier and more human. In chapter 28, the guards who had been posted at the tomb went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Everything. And the response of the leadership was to pay them and to give them a story to tell instead. Whether the tomb fields are inside that word, everything, Matthew does not say. What he does say is that when reports came in from the burial grounds that weekend, the men in charge of the city bought the silence rather than investigate it. Which brings us, finally, to the destiny and to the reason this account carries the title it does. What happened to them? Matthew brings them into the holy city, has them appear to many, and abandons them there. There is no departure, no death, no second burial, no ascension. He opens a door and walks away from it. And for 2,000 years, everyone who has come after him has tried to close it. By the 4th century, the difficulty was already open and acknowledged. Jerome wrestled with the sequence. Augustine wrestled with it harder, and his discomfort is documented. He could not make the order of Matthew's sentence sit comfortably with the priority of Christ's own resurrection, and he said so rather than pretending the problem away. The crux you have been holding for the last 20 minutes is not a modern invention. It is 16 centuries old, and it was found by the tradition's own best readers. And out of that difficulty, 2 answers hardened, and neither has ever defeated the other. The first, they died again. What they received was restored mortal life, exactly as Lazarus received it, a sign given for a moment and then withdrawn. They walked into Jerusalem, they were seen, and in time, they went back into the ground like everyone else. Thomas Aquinas argued this position. It has one enormous advantage. It leaves Christ's status as first fruits completely intact, because a temporary restoration is not the same thing as resurrection. The second, they did not. What they received was the real thing. Glorified bodies, the resurrection itself, which would make them the first harvest rather than a temporary sign. That reading leans on Paul's line in Ephesians 4 about Christ ascending on high and leading captives with him, and behind that on two much older precedents. Enoch in Genesis 5, who walked with God and was not because God took him. Elijah in 2 Kings 2, taken up in the whirlwind. Israel's scriptures already contained the category of a human being whose body was not left in a grave. On this reading, that category was filled that weekend, many times over. Those two positions are theologically incompatible. They are also textually undecidable because Matthew supplies not one piece of information that would settle either one. That is the forgotten destiny, not lost, never recorded, and the silence has been filled repeatedly by people who found it unbearable. There is a late text called the Gospel of Nicodemus, which supplies exactly what Matthew withholds. Names for the raised, dialogue, a full account of what they said about the world of the dead. It is centuries too late to be a witness to anything, and I mention it only so that you will recognize the pattern when you meet it, because the pattern is everywhere. When a text leaves a hole this precisely shaped, later writers fill it. The filling is always more satisfying than the original, and it is always the part that is not true. Matthew left the hole. That is the honest thing about him. So let me bring this back to where you are sitting. There is a reason this passage has stayed with people for 2,000 years, despite being unverifiable, unrepeated, and unexplained. And I do not think it is curiosity. I think it is the interval, that day and a half when the stones were already moved and there was nothing whatsoever to see. You know that stretch. Most people who have believed anything for very long know that stretch. It is not the disaster. You can survive a disaster. It is the silence afterward, when you have been told that something has already changed and every visible fact still looks the way it looked before. That is the hardest place faith is ever asked to stand, and it is precisely the place this passage puts you. And then there is the other thing, which I have thought about more than I expected to while preparing this. Those people were, by any measure, the most extraordinary human beings in Jerusalem that weekend. They were seen. Matthew says so. They appeared to many, and not one person wrote down a single name. Their own city forgot them inside a generation. Whatever they were given, they were not given a place in the record. If some part of you suspects that your life is going unwitnessed, that the hardest and best things you have done are not being written down anywhere by anyone, I would put it to you that this passage is not a footnote for you. It is the whole point, because Matthew's claim is not that those people were remembered. It is that they were raised. The two are not the same thing, and only one of them was ever in God's gift to give. So here is what I would leave you with. The tombs outside Jerusalem were whitewashed that spring so that the living would know exactly where the dead were and keep their distance. Every year the same lime, the same careful line drawn between one side and the other. And on one Friday afternoon in the 1st century, according to a single writer who never explained himself, that line stopped holding. We do not know their names. We do not know what they said. We do not know where they went. What we have is one sentence, kept by a careful man who gained nothing by keeping it, sitting in the middle of the best attested week in ancient history, like a door someone left standing open. If this reconstruction gave you something worth sitting with, subscribe. We go back into the 1st century this way every week, with the sources on the table and the gaps left where they actually are. And if there is someone in your life standing in the interval right now, in the part where nothing can be seen yet, send this to them today. One last question, and it is the one I have not been able to put down. Matthew could have cut this. No one would have missed it. Nobody else recorded it. Nobody else repeated it. And it has cost his gospel credibility in every century since. Why do you think he kept it? Tell me below. I will be reading.